That's the story of Hansel and Gretel, right? They go out into the forest, chased there in part by the fracturing of their family. And they find a gingerbread house, which is a little bit too good to be true, right? It's not only a house, but it's made out of candy. And so maybe you might suspect that the jig is up when something's painted that beautifully on the outside. I'm oh so compassionate and embracing. And of course, inside there's a witch whose goal is to fatten up the children and to make them helpless so that she can eat them. And so fairy tales are pretty vicious in that sort of representation, but that's also a portrayal of how all devouring the maternal embrace can be if it overextends its domain. Yeah. Now, it's not like men get off easy in that Genesis story, by the way, when Eve decides she's going to put herself at the center of the moral universe, because that's what she does. She's tempted to become like a god because that's the temptation, and she clutches the serpent to her breast. Adam doesn't object, and he goes along for the ride. And then later in the story, when God wants to walk with Adam so that they're working together, let's say, Adam is hiding behind a bush because he's realized that he's naked. And so the woman and the serpent have made him self-conscious, and now he doesn't have the courage to walk with God. And when God asks him why, he blames the woman, and he blames God for making her. And so I don't want to lay this all at the feet of women, because what I saw in the universities, for example, is that, let's put it this way, that when the maternal instinct went astray, partly because it didn't have any valid target, the men just backed off and didn't oppose it. And so, they're complicit in this disintegration. But we do have a problem on our hands that's not trivial. And we also see this reflected in a growing political divide between young men in particular and young women all across the world, right? Young men are becoming more conservative.
Yeah, I know. It's
young
wonderful.
Young women are becoming more liberal. And they're also not finding each other very effectively. The political, who would have guessed that, so we got two problems. Men and women both have the vote. Now, does that mean they're political enemies? Because that's certainly one of the things that appears to be happening. And then we have the mass migration of women into workforces of a size where empathy cannot be the regulating principle. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll turn it over for your comments. If empathy was the appropriate ethos for operation in a corporation, let's say, beyond the size of the family, then the personality trait agreeableness, which is the index of compassion and empathy, would positively predict workplace performance, particularly among managers. But it isn't agreeableness that predicts. It's conscientiousness, which is a cold virtue that typifies conservatives more than liberals. Big organizations run on raw cognitive power and conscientiousness. They don't run on empathy. Little bitty families run on empathy, especially when there are infants, but that doesn't scale. And I actually think that's why the personality trait conscientiousness, which is diligence, orderliness, industriousness, is associated often with patriotism and more conservative values. I think that's why it evolved, because empathy does not scale, because everyone isn't a big, happy family. And once you exceed kin group size in your organization, you have to turn to a different ethos. And I think that's particularly problematic for unconscientious women who self-aggrandize on the basis of their compassion.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I agree with a lot of it. I keep thinking about the fact that, look, I'm a Gen Xer, and I was raised by a boomer, right, who was part of that first wave of feminism, who, they were told you can have it all at the same time, and you're kind of a failure if you don't have it all at the same time. And that generation of mothers did as told and left their kids alone for a large portion of their childhoods. And that wasn't a bad thing. And I have a great relationship with my mom. I'm not saying I'm glad she wasn't around that much, but it led to self-sufficiency and independence and absolutely no overbearing motherhood. That wasn't a thing in the 1970s or the 1980s. We were so neglected. We were called latchkey kids, where you had a key around your neck to let yourself back in after you walked home from school. And you didn't really know when your parents were going to come home. There were rules like, be home when it gets dark. Your parents had no idea where you were and really didn't care. Those were good things. Those were, building the ties for appropriate separation at the earliest possible age. Love always remains, caring and all that stays, but not overbearing motherhood or fatherhood for that matter. And that generation, so that's me now, and maybe my brother and sister, who are older. And I think we'll raise the solution to the problem that came just a little bit after we came. Because I think what started to happen was those women got into the workforce and they were doing it all, and they would commit to work because there was an understanding that they would not blow it for the next generation of women. They'd been given the keys to the kingdom. Now you come in and you do well at these jobs, and you don't talk about your kids, and you don't leave to go home early, and you don't insist on flexible work schedules. So the women did it, and they raised tough Gen X kids who were fine. But as they started to get more rights at the office, and it sounds great on paper, okay, flex time, and I only have to work part-time, and I have to leave early for this thing and the other thing and so on. And the workplace started to bend more to supporting what mothers needed in their motherly roles. The mothers were home more, and I think started to overcorrect, started to see like go from the latchkey kid to the, the helicopter parent. Right? Where I'm never leaving you alone. I'm gonna somehow overcompensate and be the parent that I didn't have, or that the generation before me didn't have. And slowly we started to migrate to parents who never leave their children alone. Mothers and fathers for that matter, but especially mothers. And that leads to helplessness. And it leads to leaning into victimization and finding the newest disorder and overplaying any injury, because you can get attention that way, especially when you have a mother whose competition you can potentially beat by overacting your injury or your upset, et cetera. Like if you're in competition with a job and she's got to go to the job and you know that, you don't do anything as the child. You understand that's the deal. But if there's a split between her attentions and you've got to play for it, I think you lean into more upset, more victimhood, more things that would get a mother's attention naturally. Like, I have a disorder. I'm not well. I need extra help.
Yeah, well, that'll get her attention if she doesn't have anything better to do. And it has no sense, right? But that is another example of that exaggeration of compassion to the point that it becomes toxic. And the fact that it's necessary to human beings, especially in the early years, like vital, also means that it's a very difficult force to regulate. I mean, the general rule for caretaking, and this goes for the elderly as well, pretty much anybody you're actually taking care of, is don't do anything for anyone that they can do for themselves, right? Because you're actually stealing from them, not helping them. Certainly one of the rules for psychotherapy, insofar as there are actual rules for that enterprise, which has probably become now more destructive than useful, is that people have to make their own way, right? You listen and you help people strategize and you ask them questions, but you don't provide them with the direction for their life, because that's their enterprise. And that requires it requires a hard bound on compassion, that's for sure, because you don't want to get in there and interfere. Can I ask you a little bit about the way that you constructed your own family and career pathway? Because I've been working with my wife, trying to sketch out, she does a podcast on issues related to femininity. And we've been trying to sketch out, at least hypothetically, something like a appropriate timeline for young women, because they have no real guidance in that. And so here's a stat for you. We hit this milestone last year. Half of Western women, 30 and under, have no child. So it's a little more than half now. So we hit more than half. half of them will never have a child. And 90% of them will regret it. That means we're setting up, this is a catastrophe. This is a catastrophe if it's true, and the data are pretty clear, I believe. This means we're setting up 1 woman in 4 for isolation, right? And that gets increasingly brutal as you get older. And I also think we're setting up that 25% of women to be preyed upon in a manner like nothing we've ever seen when they enter their later years, because they'll have no one to keep an eye out for them, especially during times of vulnerability. This is not going to be good. So let me sketch out an idea for you in terms of a timeline and tell me what you think about that. I mean,
Okay.
1 couple in 3 have fertility problems by the age of 30. And that's defined as not being able to conceive within a year of trying.
Right.
And so it seems pretty obvious. All assistive reproductive technology notwithstanding, which is very expensive and very unreliable and certainly not something to be depended on except in cases of absolute necessity. Having your children before you're 30 is a wise move if you want to ensure that it's going to happen. And so then the question is order. You know, we're best served probably as human beings to have our children in our 20s and probably our early 20s. And of course, that's going to be more demanding for women, more demanding and more of an opportunity, I would say, because each child really requires something approximating 3 years of pretty dedicated care. You know, the data seem to show that if your child is 3 and reasonably social, then social education, daycare, can work. Before that, especially with transformation of caregivers, it doesn't look like it's a very good idea. So you need 3 years per child. And maybe you want 2 children or 3 children. And so that's something like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years that you have to devote to it. Now, women live about 6 or 7 years longer than men. So that's kind of an interesting little twist on the whole situation.